my name is Tom, and this is everything you need to know about inflation for A-level economics. Now, what is inflation? Inflation is defined as the average rise in prices. Now, this is expressed as a percentage over a time period, normally a year. The UK government aims for 2% inflation. It is currently 2.2%, and I'd recommend keeping up to date with that figure. Some other definitions that you should be familiar with. Firstly, deflation, which is a fall in the average price level, so prices are going down. Negative inflation. Disinflation is another term, and this is when prices are rising, but they're rising at a slower rate. So inflation is decreased, but it's not negative. So, for example, it's gone from 5% to 2%. And finally, hyperinflation. Now, this is inflation at a super high level. So, for example, 200%. If you do A-level history, you might be familiar with what happened in Germany in the 1930s. That would be considered hyperinflation. Look at how we measure inflation. So there are two main ways of measuring inflation in the UK. Firstly, there's the CPI, and what that is the HMFCE finds out what the average family spends their income on. There is then a basket of goods that is created from this survey, and then inflation is calculated using this basket of goods. So effectively, a survey is put out, families tell this survey what they spend their money on average, then the basket of goods is created, which is weighted based on how much money each family spends on each item, and then inflation is calculated from this weighted basket of goods. The RPI inflation index is slightly different from the CPI. It is the same method. It's a survey creating a basket of goods, which is then weighted, and then you can calculate inflation from that. But it's a little bit different. So it was the main inflation index in the UK until 2004, when it was replaced with the CPI. And it's different because it includes housing costs, such as payments on mortgage interest and council tax, and these are not included in the CPI. So the RPI was replaced for better comparisons with Europe, who use the CPI, and because the CPI is typically lower, which makes the government look a bit better. So some criticisms of inflation indexes and why they're not 100% accurate. Firstly, the average household does not exist. Pensioner households and parent households have very different spending patterns, for example. Parent households will spend more on food and are therefore more affected by an increase in food prices, so the average family does not exist. Where a price change accompanies the introduction of a new model, it's hard to assess the real change in price. For example, if the price of a computer stays constant, but the performance improves, the CPI stays constant, then one could argue it should fall. And finally, the pattern of consumer goods is always changing, and there's a time lag that occurs between this change in spending and its representation in the CPI and RPI. Now we're going to look at the costs of inflation. First disadvantage that we're going to look at is a fall in international competitiveness. So if inflation rises faster in the UK than it does in other countries, then our goods become less competitive because they're more expensive. If this is the case, less UK goods will be brought abroad and imports will be cheaper than domestic products. As a result, there will be a negative effect on the balance of payments. People will be exporting less and importing more, and this has a negative effect on economic growth. Because remember, GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M, and when X minus M goes down, GDP also goes down. And this also has a loss of jobs because GDP and employment is linked. Disadvantage that we're going to look at is confidence in the future economy is likely to fall. So for individuals to spend money and for firms to invest money, they must feel confident about the future health of the economy. High inflation can indicate that the economy is overheating and a recession is on the horizon, and therefore confidence decreases. As a result, consumers start to save instead of spend, and firms reduce investment. This reduces economic growth. And remember on the previous slide, GDP is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So when C and I, consumption and investment decreases, so does GDP. Final disadvantage we're going to look at is those on fixed wages suffer. So anybody in a fixed income will suffer when inflation rises. If you think about it, when inflation happens, your money gets less valuable, but those on a fixed wage will have the same amount of it. Therefore, their standard of living decreases. So if you look at in recent years, when we've experienced high levels of inflation, many workers have failed to negotiate wage rises in line with inflation. And what this leads to is a reduced standard of living for many, and also strikes, which decrease productivity. So if we look at in recent years the junior doctor strikes and the train strikes, that's all because they haven't been able to negotiate wage rises in line with inflation. Low and stable inflation. It's worth mentioning that there is no benefits to high inflation, but there are a few you can talk about for when inflation is low and stable. Firstly, people feel richer. We call this the wealth effect. Homeowners will see the value of their assets, houses and shares increase over time, whilst the value of their debt falls over time. This creates a wealth effect where people feel richer than they actually are, and so increase their consumer spending. And this increases real GDP. Now, another positive of inflation is that it prevents deflation. And deflation is a serious issue and can lead to a dramatic slowdown in an economy. So if prices are falling month on month, then people are more likely to just wait and purchase things later. Think about it. If you've got some money and you're looking to spend it on a car, why would you spend it on a car now when prices are falling and next month that car is going to be cheaper? So consumers and firms will put off spending until these prices are cheaper. And this causes GDP to fall dramatically. The last advantage to low and stable inflation is that wage rates become less of a contentious issue. With low inflation, pay disputes are less likely, which leads to less strikes and greater productivity, and this stability can also help attract FDI. If inflation is at, let's say, 1%, then an employer is going to be happy to give wage rises at 1% to all their employees, and employees are going to be happy that their wage has risen in line with inflation. So overall, low and stable inflation is generally considered good, but high inflation and deflation are very harmful for the economy. So thanks for listening, and make sure you subscribe for more A-level economics content to help you smash your exams.